Yeah, thank you very
So
much for having me.
the audience is all
My
yours.
apologies to everyone for not being able to be present in Athens today. I had a lovely trip last year to speak at the conference, and sadly I had some difficulties with my travel this week, and with the flight cancellation, I was unable to actually make my connection to make it to Athens today. So thank you to the audio-visual crew for accommodating my internet request to present to you today here from far away. And I'm here, I don't want to dwell on that. I want to talk to you about some of the research we've done at Sophos on the security of the Internet of Things. So I'm going to present to you when your toys attack. Securing the IoT is harder than it looks, and sadly, this is something I learned in my research, and I'm going to briefly explain my job. I work at Sophos, and I'm a researcher, so most of my work is spent in our lab looking not just at malware, but at security threats in general. So I have a pretty broad job description, if you will. I get to kind of look at a lot of different kinds of security, and in the end, I end up speaking a lot, working in the lab, and well, usually on airplanes. Sadly, not on an airplane with you today, but that is something that I travel around a lot to talk about the research that we're doing. And my boss and I had a conversation about a year and a half, 2 years ago, about the Internet of Things. That this is a very important topic that we know is going to impact a lot of businesses and organizations, and what could we learn about it to try to start providing some advice? I mean, clearly we can't go out and secure tens of thousands of different kinds of devices themselves, but what could we do to help businesses deal with the potential risk to our networks and our data that's being presented by these Internet of Things? So we had to start by defining what do we really consider to be an IoT device, and this is a very different idea to different people. And so clearly this could encompass things like industrial control systems, energy monitoring tools, whether that be temperature, pressure sensors, lots of different things. Clearly the transportation sector uses a lot of these basic, if you will, dumb devices that are monitoring things that enable shipping and air traffic control, etc. And some of this is now coming into our personal lives with things like cars, and Tesla is a great example, but it's a lot more than Tesla now, right? I mean, our Volkswagens and BMWs and Mercedes have sensors in them, and they're starting to communicate with one another. And that's one kind of IoT. But for the purpose of the research I was doing, I was thinking more about what we think of using at home and that we might bring to work with us. Not things that we intentionally buy as a business, like a sensor that we know we've brought in to control temperature of a system, but maybe something that somebody brings in from home. So, these are the smart light bulbs, the web cameras, maybe literally in our house, it might be toys like, the Barbie dolls or these types of things. But even, smart televisions. I surveyed the last 4 or 5 months while traveling. Almost every business I go into has a smart TV as a display device now in a conference room because it's cheaper than a projector. And so, you're probably seeing me on a projector right now in the conference hall, but in your office, you probably present regularly on a Samsung television or an LG television or something that is probably more cost effective to have in your office as a display device. But that also has a webcam. That thing may also be on the internet. So I wanted to look at those types of devices and what risks they present to business more than perhaps just the temperature sensors of the industrial internet. Oops, let's see. So I thought, where do I start? So I just went to Google and I literally said IoT security, just out of curiosity. What would I find on Google if I searched for IoT security? And it took me to a website called IoT.do. in a subpage of it called security. And I mean, ironically, the web certificate for this website was invalid and did not work. So it seems sort of foreboding that maybe the security situation with IoT wasn't just bad because of carelessness in manufacturing. The whole sector seems to lack an idea of what security is. And so then I thought, well, let's look at some of the standards that they must use to build these devices. And I thought, there must be just a few of them. I can at least start to look at the specifications. How do these standards work? And I was overwhelmed. You can see a word chart there on the screen that some of the different types of technologies used in IoT devices. But over the course of 3 or 4 days, I found over 100 different standards that were used, including operating systems, wireless standards, APIs, all kinds of different things. So that was a bit intimidating as well, because there wasn't really an obvious thing to look at to try to assess the security, and it almost seemed like the cartoon you see on the screen, almost a bit of a joke. That when there's too many standards, what is the answer? Well, maybe we'll just make a new standard, and somehow we'll combine all these standards into something that becomes a one true standard. And obviously that wasn't really working either. So, for my research, what I really wanted to try to find was some advice that might be universal, or at least to give security professionals and IT professionals an idea of where to look and what types of things they might do to better protect both these devices, but especially their networks and their data where these devices might be introduced. There's no way to enumerate or to look at every single device and give some specific advice, but we want to look at the kind of bigger picture and identify what those mitigations might be to reduce the risk of these devices in our environments. So, I mean, my findings, some interesting things. One, almost all of these devices rely on the cloud. So that, can be concerning, but it can also be a point of control. Because these things use Amazon Web Services, Google Cloud, Microsoft's Azure system, etc. That's one way that you can identify that they might be on your network. When you see anomalous traffic or unusual traffic going out to these services, that's one thing to look for. Now, if you're a home user, it's the other way around. If you have a smart light bulb, you may not want it to talk to the cloud, and that's something that becomes more complicated. Sadly, almost none of these devices used any real security or TLS. So most of them used plain HTTP to talk to the internet, which introduces a lot of vulnerability. Most of us aren't really that concerned whether our government or our neighbor knows that we're turning our light bulb on and off. But the risk there is that anybody can then intercept and interfere with that traffic, right? You can impersonate. One of the things you get from TLS or SSL traffic is that it can't be interfered with. Nobody can do a man-in-the-middle attack necessarily of that if it's done correctly. Most of these devices had no validation of the traffic at all. So I could observe you turning your light bulb on, and then I could replay that attack over and over and over again. They require a lot of really wide open holes in the firewall, and if you see there on the screen in the lower left corner it says universal plug and play, which is a protocol that is designed to automatically open holes in firewalls. Many of these devices rely on that UPnP protocol, and that's very concerning as well, because we would never recommend anybody allow that traffic on their network, because UPnP basically allows malware or an intruder to open holes in the firewall because there's no authentication. Basically, it turns off your firewall, right? I mean, UPnP says, allow me to communicate or allow this traffic to come in with no validation that that's a legitimate thing. It's very concerning. So, there's a lot of marketing involved in this as well, which was kind of entertaining to me. Here's a few of the devices I bought. Turns out, I believe all three of these companies have gone out of business before I could report vulnerabilities in the products to them, which is another concern about this type of product. The product you see there on the left, Okie Dokies, that's a automatic door locking system that you can use Bluetooth to open your home door locks remotely or obviously within Bluetooth range. And then the two on the right are light bulbs. And I was able to find vulnerabilities in all three of these within a few minutes of testing them. And all three companies were actually not in business before I could report those vulnerabilities. So the idea that we can hold companies responsible for fixing things is also not really playing out to be true. We kind of have to own the responsibility for protecting these devices or not, not allowing them on our networks ourselves. We can't really rely on a third party to provide us fixes and updates. And that's kind of a new paradigm as well, because we're used to our Macs and our PCs and a lot of big companies like Apple and Microsoft being available to us to provide fixes. We can't necessarily know that these devices are going to be fixed. And the risk can be quite large. And we often joke sort of that, I've got a smart thermostat at my house, and so what if someone hacks it, right? I mean, all they can do is make it hot. They can turn off my air conditioning. But it's a lot bigger than that, and we have to start thinking about this, societally and not just as individuals, because we saw with Mirai, of course, the botnet capabilities last autumn, where Amazon and other service providers were affected by the denial of service attacks. But more than that, you start considering the power utility in your community. And what if someone was able to turn every air conditioner in your entire city on within 1 second, right? That would take down the grid. And that's not something your power utility can defend against. Your government can't protect you from that, and your power utility can't protect you from that, because that's something that's external. It's a decision you're making as an individual at your home to have these things, and if they can be hacked, it can create an enormous amount of disruption and damage. And of course, the last two pictures there with the big data and the dog with the spyglasses is, there's privacy issues as well. The huge amounts of data being collected by things like Google Home and Amazon Alexa, etc. So all of this leads us to, what are we going to do about this, and what can we do about it? Because we can't just sit idly by, and I don't think we can stop this. I mean, we're going to have smart cars, and we're going to continue to have more and more cameras and other things out there that are being introduced to the internet, and there's no way to prevent this from happening. So, as individuals, there's a few things we can do. Clearly, with our Wi-Fi routers and things, we can set up separate SSIDs and try to isolate these devices from our sensitive data. We don't want them where our file servers are that may have our individual information and personal information. We can disable things like universal plug and play to ensure that our firewalls don't just start opening up holes and allowing attackers to invite themselves into our networks. We need to keep the firmware up to date. And I think the most important thing I have on the screen to me is the Ethernet cable that's cut in the lower right-hand corner. If it doesn't need to be connected, don't connect it. I have a smart television from LG sitting in my living room at home, and it can play Netflix and it can play YouTube and it can do all these things. But I also have a Roku and I also have an Xbox. Do I really need to connect my smart television to the internet? I can stream YouTube from my Xbox. I don't really need all of these devices to be connected all of the time. So another way we can be more careful with this is be selective about what kinds of devices we're connecting to our networks and determining whether they really need to be connected or whether it's just that we want them to be connected. And often I think we can reduce risk, especially for devices where we don't think they're going to be updated, by locking down that firewall and then maybe just not connecting the things that don't need to be connected. Other issues, at the bigger picture from a business perspective that we might be able to do is looking at, is regulation going to be effective? I mean, the EU has been considering regulation around IoT devices and security of them. Regulation has a place. It's complicated. I mean, these devices are largely manufactured outside of the EU or even North America, and regulation is not going to stop those devices from being deployed worldwide. They may not be sold in Europe, but that doesn't really help if all the devices in Vietnam and in Brazil are attacking your server. That doesn't really help you that much. But regulation may have a role to play. I think what we're looking more at is to fix these devices are the two right-hand things. The one in the middle there is a nutrition guide. And the idea there is that when you buy a device, educate consumers on how long will this device get updates from the manufacturer, and does it meet any security qualifications perhaps by external organizations. We can start to put some seals on things to certify that they've met some standards and let consumers choose to buy things that perhaps are more secure. And the one on the right is meant to represent frameworks. The idea there is most of these devices are insecure because they're using very old versions of Linux that Chinese manufacturers have just taken off the internet and decided that's a cheap, easy way to make their device work, and just deployed it, even though it may have a bunch of insecure old Linux applications installed. So one thing we might do is provide some free operating systems for manufacturers to deploy that are maintained by third parties. And how that might work is still unclear, but both the EU, the United States, and Canada have working groups looking at how we might fund such a thing to provide some free operating systems that are maintained to fix vulnerabilities and provide a more secure framework for deploying IoT devices. And on that note, that's my thoughts on IoT. Sadly, there's no great answers here for anyone around how to secure them, other than looking at your network traffic, trying to identify that they're present, certainly in the business environment, and asking your vendors to be responsible. And one of my customers is a energy company, and they're now requiring any vendor that bids to provide them products to meet some basic security requirements around encryption being present, these types of things. Start including that in your bid process and requirements for your products, so that vendors understand how important that is, and that it's something you value as a business and as a customer to protect your network. Oh, so on that, thank you very much for your time. And if you have any questions, I encourage you to visit our partners over at NSS at their stand at the hall. And if you have any questions for me, please direct them to NSS, and they'll send them my way, and I'll be happy to get back to you with any kind of response I can to assist with your questions.